I'm going to let Jeffrey tell a little bit of his story about who he is as a discographer and as a klezmer aficionado and as a discographer in a few minutes. But before we get there, I'd like to introduce Sherry Mayrent, who is going to tell us a little bit about something that maybe many of you have come for, which is to hear one of two unheard Belf sides that Sherry has recently discovered. And while Sherry's talking, I'd like to ask you to get a pencil and a piece of paper or to open up a note-taking app on your computer for when we start listening. But I'm going to hand it over to Sherry. Why don't you tell us about this disc and how you got it?
Okay, well, I have a lot of searches set up on eBay, and one of them is for Sirena. And I'm always very excited when I see a Sirena label coming up in my search results. And most of the time, my heart racing is for naught, because either I already have them if it's a Belf thing or it's not a Belf thing. So this was about a month ago, and my engineer, Chris King, had just come out to the house to pick up the latest batch of records. Usually I drive them down to him in Virginia, but because of my knee, I'm not going anywhere long anytime soon. So he offered to do the schlepping this time. So he came and we were talking about records, and we were talking about Belf and this and that. And just as after he went to bed, I just thought, well, gee, I haven't done eBay pretty much since my surgery, so I should go see if there's anything there. And the first thing that came up, because I always check the Sirena one first, was this disc. And I looked at it and I thought, yay, it's Belf. Okay. And then I checked it against my database and it wasn't in there. And then I opened it up and looked at the title, and I thought, I haven't seen this title before. So I put in a bid, a ridiculously high bid, because I wanted to make sure I could get it. And then basically held my breath for the next 5 days to make sure that I got it. And when it arrived, I listened to it to make sure that it in fact wasn't one that I'd ever heard before. And it was very exciting. So I kind of put the word out, and then Christina contacted me and said, hey, would you mind if we made this part of the promotion for Jeff's talk? And I said, absolutely. So
here we are. Fantastic. So I know we have a bunch of Belf heads here. We are all here for the Belf, and I am here for the Belf. We are all here for the Belf. So I'm going to ask you to do an impossible thing, which is we're going to listen to this track, and I'd like you to make some notes if you have thoughts, responses, comments, ideas, anything that you have that you as a response to this track. Memorialize them in writing in some way, because after we listen to this track, I would like to not talk about it. I want us to hold our thoughts about that track until we get to the end of the talk. And if you feel that you must talk about the track, don't do it in the chat here. I'm going to ask you to take it onto WhatsApp or some other platform so that we can turn the microphone fully over to Jeff, who's going to tell us his incredibly researched story about the Belf Orchestra and possibly the identity of, knowing who this cat really was. So, but here's the track, and I have also not listened to it, so this is a first for me too. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, Sherry, for sharing that with us. That is amazing. So hold that thought, all those thoughts. Hold all of those thoughts, and I'm going to now just turn it over to Jeffrey, who's going to tell us, I think first, I want to ask about how it is that you got into Jewish records and, early recorded Jewish music.
I'm sure. Christina, first I want to thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's wonderful to see you. How I first got interested in Jewish records, my parents both grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and they and all my older relatives spoke Yiddish. I lived in Borough Park my first few years myself until we moved to nearby Midwood, and these are both very Jewish neighborhoods. So when I was very young, and by young I mean 2 years old, I absolutely loved records of all kinds. In those days, they were all 78s, by the way. We didn't have many records, but they made such a great impression on me that I remember them vividly. When I was 4 or 5, now living in Midwood, my father came home one day with a red label Columbia disc by Aaron Lebedev with Abe Elstein's orchestra. I'm sure many of you know it, Romania on one side and the Oberste von Stesel on the other side. My parents loved Lebedev. I didn't know who Abe Elstein was until many, many years later. Romania was exciting, but the one I really loved was Oberste von Stesel, a song in Husidl tempo composed by Sholem Sekunda. More than anything, I loved the instrumental break in the middle, which is pure klezmer music. Until many years later, I didn't know the clarinet solo was Dave Tarras. At that age, I didn't even know it was a clarinet. But I loved that record so much, I literally wore it out. When I was 10, a friend of mine from school found a stack of maybe 20 Jewish 78s from the 1920s in a discard pile in his apartment house basement. He was the only one of my friends that spoke Yiddish at home. His parents were both Holocaust survivors, but he wasn't interested in the records himself, and he knew I would be. I'd begun learning Yiddish that year, and I used to try to talk to him a little in Yiddish. Over the following years, I acquired other records that my parents brought home from local bazaars or given to me by relatives. I never collected systematically. I wound up with a nice collection anyway. I don't know the number of discs, but probably less than 100. But until the very end of this period, I knew almost nothing about these records other than the records themselves. Not even my father could tell me much.
I have to say that I'm just jealous that I mean, like, the experience of having that as your record format to me is actually kind of awesome. Yeah.
I mean,
It's a special sound, and it's a special way to listen to records. So that is very cool. And so how did you get to Belf? Like, you started with Aaron Lebedev, and eventually you've become this Belfologist of the nth degree.
Well, it was the same way as many other people in the beginning. Up until well in the 1990s, it wasn't even known that klezmer had been recorded much in Europe before World War I. We had some one-off things, like Leon Al, some beautiful violin, but they seemed to be just isolated. In the late 1970s, Hank Isnetsky had discovered several 10-inch Belf discs on the Sirena label in the library of Gratz College in Philadelphia, but essentially nobody knew that. And I didn't either until I started doing my own research much later. In 1983, one Belf Husidl was included on Martin Schwartz's klezmer music, the first recordings. And in 1991, my Yofis and Besser Bin Hora were on Sapoznik and Spotswood's Klezmer Pioneers. And in 1992, Yichis and Simchis Chora were on Martin Schwartz's Yichis. And then I think in the mid 1990s, Kurt Bjorlin collected all the known Belf sides onto 2 cassettes for his resource tapes. And that was, I think, 24 sides. So maybe we could hear, I like to play Husidl because that was the first one that anybody heard in the modern times.
Right. And I think for those of us who are kind of Belf heads, this isn't necessarily like the go-to tune. So as a refresher, I think it's good to listen to this. I'm going to do something which I often do, which is I'm going to start this at the second repetition, mostly because I oftentimes find that starting at the second time through the tune, they really got it cooking. So here we go.
Yeah, that's very nice. You know, where did you get the thing about that cut is the sound quality is really good compared to what it was on that reissue.
Yes.
Um,
It was in my files. I mean, it's not that I don't want to tell you where it came from. I
okay.
don't happen to know at the moment. But yeah, it's a nice, clean transfer. It could very well, it's entirely possible that it's from the Mayrent collection. And, so
Okay, but
no, not.
in general,
It's like, no.
in general, the sound quality of these sirens was pretty bad and made worse by wear and tear.
Sure.
But their very existence aroused great interest, obviously, and surprise. The style of playing deepened the mystery because it was clearly klezmer, but kind of style that we never heard before, kind of archaic sounding. And then, and they were billed on the labels as Belf's Romanian Orchestra, Bucharest. But at the same time, they were obviously Jewish, since most of their titles were in Yiddish or Hebrew, and the music was of a definitely Jewish type, though some were Romanian, but they did not sound like what I thought of as Romanian Jewish playing style either. The very first recording reissued, Chusel, yeah, Christina, okay, you told me that it was documented by Piotr Stelliarsky as Moldavian, but you said that it also probably came in to Moldova.
Yeah, I think that this is in the Stoyanov collection. And I can't remember what number it is, but it's in the Hora section. But I think that Zev sort of alerted me to the connection with the Belf tune of Chesed. But in Stoyanov, the parts are reversed, and so the Moldavian version starts on the B part, and then modulates down to the A part, and it changes the character of the piece entirely. And I think Zev would agree with me that he sort of demonstrated to me that this is probably a case where a Jewish tune got into the Moldavian repertoire rather than being the reverse case, But so there is a connection to Moldova, but it's not that this tune came from Moldavian into Jewish, but it went the other way. So, yeah.
Okay, but in terms of the playing style, we had Romanian Jewish performers like Joseph Moskowitz, Max Leibowitz, Abe Schwartz, Abe Katzman, who recorded only a few years after Belf, and they really have a different kind of style. I could ask Paul Gifford, but I didn't get the impression that you considered Belf actually a Romanian orchestra. Did you? No.
Was that? Say that again.
He's shaking. He said no.
He's like, no.
Muted, but
Yeah.
that's okay. We got that. All right. So, anyway, in the mid 1990s, I got interested in the histories of these recordings and the bands that made them. Now, and I read with great interest Zev Feldman's article, Bulgariaska, Bulgarish, Bulgar, Transformation of a Klezmer Dance Genre. This was really the first scholarly study of klezmer music in English, and when it appeared in 1994. And this finally kicked me into historical gear. I drew up a list of questions I had about the history of klezmer music and musicians, and I saw the Belf recordings as a topic that seemed to fall right in the middle of this knowledge gap. The questions seemed impossible to answer, but at least they formed a framework. I was very frustrated that so little was known about the musicians who recorded this music.
Mhm.
So what was known about Belf 25 years ago? Virtually nothing. In fact, there was even legends floating around that were like misinformation or, to
Yeah,
throw.
well, I mean, I can tell you, like, we made up all kinds of stuff because we didn't know anything. Like when I was living in Budapest, we had all kinds of crazy stories about who these cats were, based on no actual knowledge. So, yeah, your article was a revelation in '97, that '97 article.
Well, I'm
So,
going to tell you, I'll tell you how it came about.
yeah,
I was just very propelled by this frustration. And one day I marched into, it was actually January 19th, 1995. I went to the sound archive at the Performing Arts Division of the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center. Unlike Mike Aylward, who I did not yet know of, I didn't start looking through old record catalogs, but with the help of librarian archivist Sarah Velez, I discovered, to my amazement, microfiches of some Russian trade journals of the recording industry from the period in which the Belf recordings were thought to have originated, especially Gramophone in Mir and Gramophone Жизнь, Gramophone World and Gramophone Life. Cyrena advertised regularly in these journals, and among the many announcements of latest releases, I found Belf releases as well. This became the basis of the first attempt at a Belf discography, which you referred to there, published in the Journal of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, or ARSC Journal, in 1997. I found many more Belf releases than were known. I think there were 24 on Kurt's cassettes, all of which were issued between 1912 and 1914, when the war brought the releases to a sudden halt. At the same time, I also documented Russian klezmer releases in that same period by many other artists. Almost exactly 5 years later, when Kurt Bjorling discovered some additional Belf Cyrenas in Toronto in late 2001, I went back to the library and I discovered that I had missed 10 Belf titles released in July 1912. And the reason that I missed them, I will tell you in just a second, but I don't have time for the whole story about Kurt's discoveries today. Now, what were my main findings in this Belf article? Okay, aside from the expanded discography documenting 54 Belfs, and as I said, I should have had 64, 18 on Serena, 18 on Extraphone, and 10 on Amor, 68 more sides than were known at the time. There was
amazing.
an important historical finding, an actual mention of Belf in an item about the Cyrena Company in a little column in Gramophone in Mir, June 25th, 1912. And before I go on, that's the reason I missed the 10 Belfs, because they were in that issue. And I was so blown away by finding this, I forgot to look at the advertisements.
Totally right.
Anyway, speaking of the company's manager, this is what the pseudonymous Tourist writes. All the business, all the reins of management are concentrated in the hands of Chief Director Fabian Lazarovich Temple, who indeed turns out to be the energetic inspirer of all the projects and a specialist at ferreting out hit numbers. Who would have supposed that a poor Jewish musician, Belf, could have bought himself a house in his hometown out of the proceeds which the factory paid him? But who dug up and contracted this Belf? Temple. And do you know, readers, how many of Belf's records the factory sells? Every day, not less than 2,000 to 3,000 items are shipped south, yet new orders pour in endlessly. So that's the end of that. But this may not sound like much, but it was the first solid information about Belf, and it revealed a number of things we could not otherwise have known. Belf was an ordinary, impoverished Jewish klezmer. He was discovered by manager Temple. He was given a contract by Cyrena. The record sold very well, especially to the south, meaning Ukraine. Belf did well financially, even buying a new house in his hometown.
Right. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot. And it's like it's like what Michael was saying in his talk, talking about Sirota, or one of the cantors who made as much on recording 20 sides in a year as he did from his whole congregation,
Right.
for being a cantor for the whole year. So the idea that this Belf character could buy himself a new house, out of the proceeds from these thousands and thousands of records that are streaming south every month.
Right.
And then this trade guys going like, what's going on here? Like, how can this be? Like, what's with this
Right.
Jewish music selling thousands of records? Like, how do we
Right.
get in on this, right?
Right.
Is that kind of the tone of this whole thing? Is
It's kind of like but there's another element, which is that a large percentage of the people reading this journal, the Jewish, the record dealers were Jewish, and so, and especially they were Russian because it's in Russian. So yes, you're right, and but I want to talk about now what we've learned since that time. 25 years. And no, actually, no, before I get to that, there's more in the article that I want to review. I want to call your attention to. We're talking about, he built a house in his hometown. But of course, the question comes, what was his hometown? That's a big question. Was it in Romania? Was it in somewhere else? And what was it? And I noted, I was skeptical about Bucharest or Romania, but a small number of Belf titles are based on place names. So like Skvirskaya, Lipovitskaya, Mogilevskaya, Khotinskaya, these are all places. And they actually fall into a distinctive geographical pattern, which borders on Romania, but extends through Podolia, all of Podolia, and into Kiev gubernia. So I actually have a map. Let's show the map.
Let's share the map. Let's do that. We're going to stop sharing that. We're going to start sharing this. Well, let's look at this. So this will be available later, but Sherry has also graciously shared the record label scan from the Oleandra that we listened to before. We'll make that available later, but here is that map.
Okay, in the middle of the map, you see Podolia outlined in red. But you see, I've made this green line crossing into Podolia and through Podolia. Do you all see that?
I'm tracing it with my
Sort of a
cursor
light
here.
green line, right. So if you go up to the northeast, you see Skvira up there. That's Skvirskaya is named after that shtetl. And then going down a little further, Lipovitskaya, Lipovitz, right there. And then going down through Bratslav and Tulchev and Mogilov Podolsky, that's another one, Mogilevskaya. And then you continue going through there, Kamenets Podolsky, and finally Khotin. That's another one, Khotinskaya. Now, among the records I missed, there's one called Folneshskaya, which even the N really shouldn't be there. It should be Faleshskaya. But Falesht is in Bessarabia, about 83 miles south of Mogilov Podolsky. That's not on this green line, but okay. So you see there is a pattern there though. I thought maybe that really means something. Okay. The other, so now talking about what I found since then.
I'm going to stop this share.
And so let's see what some of the questions anyway. Besides Belf's real what was his real base of operations? We'd like to know how old he was, what were his family connections, exactly when were the recordings made, are the other musicians on the recording really from his shtetl Kapelia? And I found information pertinent to these questions in 3 main documentary sources. And this is not in the article. This is more recent.
Mm-hmm.
A novel, a biography, and an official government document. Now, you may wonder how a novel, a work of fiction,
gets on your list of evidence,
right.
Like historical novels, evidence, maybe, that's not usually something that historians rely on for data or documentation. So that is interesting,
Right. So I'll just explain a little bit that every human production whether written or not, originates in some time and place and social context. And therefore, it can be in some way a sign of its origins. That is a historical document, even a work of pure fiction. Admittedly, fiction is very difficult for historians to handle. In this case, we have something that's a little bit better for our purposes than just regular fiction. It's a historical novel, confessedly based on the life of its hero, a real person. Although the text takes great liberties, we know that the author interviewed the subject about his actual life before writing the novel, and there was a reason for that, and some of it must be reflected in the novel. A historical novel is a mix of fact and fiction. We have to try to winnow out the fact from the fiction. With a famous historical figure like Henry VIII, that is easy. But with an unknown like Belf, it's difficult. Yet in the end, it's as with any historical document, you have to first fully weigh the functions and context and likely bias of the document, and two, compare it against independent sources. See if, So first of all, what does this historical novel have to do with Belf? Well, the novel is called Klezmer by the Soviet Yiddish writer Yuma Drucker, 1906 to 1982. It was written in Yiddish, and there was also a Russian translation.
That's this one, right?
Here's
This next slide.
the title page of it. Yeah, this is from the second edition, 1976 edition, as you can see on the bottom, Moskva, 1976. Now, there's a minor character in this novel called Velvel Belfour, who happens to be the clarinetist in a capella led by one Shloime Malarsky in the town of Lipovitz. In fact, Belfour is Shloime's son-in-law. Not much is said about him other than that he's a wonderful clarinetist, an emissar kishifmacher, a real magician. But for the very fact that he is there is worth a close look. Shloime's youngest child, his son Ezra, is the hero of the book, a fictionalized version of Pesach Stelliarsky, or Piotr Stelliarsky, the great Soviet violin teacher. I don't remember exactly when I first came across this novel, but it must have been sometime between 1997 and about 2000. And later I found out that Joel Rubin had noted this independently, and I think Michael Alpert did as well. Is that right? And the novel, first published in 1940, is based on the life of a famous Soviet violin teacher, Piotr Stelliarsky, who did come from a Klezmer family in Lipovitz. Now, the name that he's given in the novel, Malarsky, comes from Russian Malyar, house painter, and Stelliarsky is Stelliar, carpenter. So, it's like thinly fictionalized name. So does Velvel Belfour have anything to do with the real clarinetist V. Belf? That's the question.
Right. Was it that question. Yeah.
Why did he give him this name? Is it sheer coincidence? But it's also unlikely to be a historical illusion because, like in this book, Podotzer has a very big part in the book, but that is a historical illusion, although it's quite fictional in the book. But because there's no point making an illusion unless you expect your readership to catch it. And in 1940, when this novel appeared, very few would have recognized the name. His moment of fame was short and had long since passed. And a lot of things had happened in between since then. And besides, the name on the record was Belf, not Belfour. In the novel, Shloime Malarsky has two daughters, Broshka and Friedel, and two sons, Label and Ezra. The two daughters are married to the clarinetist and a violinist, respectively. It's not even clear who's married to who, but it doesn't matter. Who both play in their father's band. The clarinetist is Velvel Belfour, the violinist is called Gedalia Kneifel, and he's a nephew of Stempanu. The married couples must be quite young as they don't have any children yet. Label is called a bocher. That means he had his bar mitzvah we could say he's a teenager.
Right.
He's not married yet. And his younger brother, Ezra, is specifically said to be 7 years old in the opening, what we call establishing scene, and this takes place on a Shabbos in the spring of or early summer. Shlomo Malarski in Lipovitz, and Shlomo Malarski had previously lived in Linitz, a shtetl 20 kilometers, about 12 miles southeast of Lipovitz. But because of exploitative treatment from the leader of the Klezmer Kapelye there, and there's a class conflict that has to be there.
Right. It has to be in every Soviet novel, should have
Right.
some good bougie class conflict to, elevate the poor worker, even the klezmorim, right?
Very much so. And he left Linitz and moved to Lipovitz, which did not have its own Kapelye. Label was born in Linitz, but Ezra was born in Lipovitz. Extra looks up to his brother Label, who he says can play all instruments, including the violin. In Linitz, Shlomo had played the trumpet, but at the Molever Malka, that's the sort of little party at the end of Shabbos that on that day, he plays the violin, not the trumpet. Except for Shlomo and Label, these are all minor characters. And there are others, members of the band and other family friends who are kind of like wallpaper, part of the atmosphere rather than real protagonists in the story. This is true of Velvel Belfer as well, who never even gets a speaking part. In the one scene where Velvel is described as laughing and telling stories, his voice is compared to his clarinet, but no words are given. This is because we're meant to be experiencing this scene through the eyes and especially the ears of little Ezra, who is so sensitive to sound and music. Now, Gedalia Kneifel is also a very minor character, but because he's supposed to be the nephew of Stepanu, he gets a little more attention. He's asked by a guest at the Saturday night gathering to tell a story about Stepanu. I don't know if there was a real Gedalia Kneifel, but Kneifel was a real klezmer family in Berdichev, and they were related to Stepanu. They were related to Stepanu, whose real name was Yosela Drucker, as you know. Well, the author of this book, Irma Drucker, was supposed to be related, was from the same family. So maybe he wanted to give him a cameo appearance, whether anyone else would get it or not. And then I think because he wanted to memorialize his own relationship to the real Stelliarsky and not from mere knowledge of the recordings, he would, because then he would have called him Belf, supposedly from Bucharest, rather than Belfor from Lipovitz. So he put him in too. But I also think it's significant that Belfer and Kneifel are the only ones of these band members who have surnames.
Interesting.
Even though some of the band members are more vividly drawn, especially Shoyelke, the bass player, a particular favorite of Ezra. Now, this novel, I talked about the functions, contexts, and biases of a source. So what are the functions, contexts, and biases of the novel? Well, first of all, it's a Bildungsroman. That means a story about a young person's coming of age. But whatever its qualities on that score, it is also an intentional work of Soviet propaganda, embodying the Stalinist idea of art as revolutionary praxis according to the canons of socialist realism in literature.
So,
according to Kiev literary,
I'm just going to add this, sorry to interrupt you, but we have a little question from Joel Rubin.
Yeah.
And I think you're getting to this, but this is just to reinforce it. The question is, was Maliarsky a fictionalized name, or was Stelliarsky born a Maliarsky?
No. Stelliarsky was his real name, but in the novel, he's called Maliarsky as a way. By the way, at the very beginning of the novel, actually before the novel, there's a little author's note that says specifically that this novel is based on the life of Piotr Stelliarsky, and the great. He was really very well known in Russia at that time, in Soviet Union. Well,
so Maliarsky is the painter, like that's the Maliarsky is
well, it's like a play on words, kind of, that he says.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all that is. But so talking about socialist realism, in literature. Kiev, according to Kiev Yiddish literary critic Meir Wiener in 1939, and socialist realism, quote, the authentic reality is directed into the future, into development, into revolutionary development. To see and recognize the authentic reality means to see and recognize the inevitable future in its more or less developed embryo, even if it categorically contradicts the visible reality. So, you know, in this book, Ezra the Klezmer is a socialist embryo, and his surroundings, his relatives and friends are the embryo of the future society, and he's the embryo of the future Soviet violin pedagogue. And we have to expect that many things in this story contradict reality, which they definitely do.
Amazing.
For example, just a quick example, they're sitting around the Molever Kompanye and they're talking about how much they hate rabbis. They hate this rabbi and why they hate, you know, I mean, they you know, obviously people, there could be rabbis that they disliked and Lashon Hara, as we all know, but they just hate rabbis in general. And the only one they actually, the only one they like is the Breslover, because Nachman of Breslov, because he's dead, the dead rabbi, you know. So anyway, just to give you a little more background, on May 1st, 1937, the musical world was astonished by the powerful showing of a group of Soviet violinists in the Eugenie Sai International Violin Concourse in Brussels. 5 of the 6 top prizes went to young Soviet violinists, all but one of whom were Jewish. Even more extraordinary, the 4 top prize winners, David Oistrakh, Boris Goldstein, Elizabeth Gilels, and Mikhail Fichtengoltz, had all studied with the same teacher in Odessa, Piotr Stelliarsky. And this was not the first time his students had won international prizes. Oistrakh, who was 28 at this time, had already won dozens, and remarkably had never studied with any other teacher. Of course, this huge triumph aroused tremendous public interest around the world, but especially in the USSR, and many Soviet journalists wrote about him, Stelliarsky. One Jewish journalist in Odessa, Yirma Drucker, who had already interviewed Stelliarsky and published articles about him, eventually wrote a novel based on his life, which is the one we're talking about. It was published in 1940 and even had a second edition in 1976. I already said that. So Stelliarsky appeared as the exemplification of the Soviet claim to provide the path by which the former oppressed proletariat could not only live a better life, but even climb to the heights of artistry and culture. Now, there was a good deal of truth in this, but it would require a great deal of selection, exaggeration, and embroidery to weave it into a socialist realist novel.
When is Stelliarsky born? Do we have a birth date for him?
Yeah, he was born either in 1870 or 1871. And I'll come to that in a minute. The biography is a short book, and we can show the cover of this too. The biography is a book called Piotr Stelliarsky, appropriately enough. There it is, by Michael Goldenshteyn, 1917 to 1989. Michael Goldenshteyn, like his brother Boris, or also known as Buzia Goldenshteyn, 1922 to 1987, was from Odessa. Both were child prodigies, and both studied with Stelliarsky from a very early age, before entering the Moscow Conservatory, where they both studied with the great violin teacher Jan Polsky. Mikhail's biography was not published until 1989, but its origins go back to the same city, Odessa, and the same period as Yirma Drucker's novel. In fact, there's a tangible connection between the two books that helps in interpreting them. In his introduction explaining how he came to write the book, Goldenshteyn covertly refers to Drucker's novel and other contemporary writings about Stelliarsky. He writes, in 1935, I took part in a competition for young violinists. Applicants came from different cities. David Oistrakh won the first prize. I was also awarded a prize and the title of laureate. After the competition, I had a lot of hugs and kisses from Stelliarsky. He invited me to study pedagogical activity and become his assistant in Odessa, where there was a school named after him at the time. Actually, this school had been set up just 2 years earlier, in 1933. The Soviet government had built a school for him and named it after him. In 1936, I became Stelliarsky's assistant. He once said to me, quote, "All kinds of journalists want to write a book about me, but I am only a political puppet, politicheskaya kukla, for them. And I want the book to be written by a musician who would understand what I live for. What is the meaning of my work? Why don't you undertake a work of this kind?" This proposal immediately interested me. And he further explains, attempts to create a book about Stelliarsky were made many times in the USSR, but the authors were fatally unlucky. And I don't know exactly what he means by fatally unlucky, but anyway, I guess
It's a pretty dark saying in the Soviet
right,
Union. You know?
exactly.
Fatally unlucky is oftentimes exactly what it sounds like.
Exactly.
You know?
Right. Other writers managed to present Stelliarsky in an allegorical literary guise, like,
Like
by
a novel, for example, right?
bypassing the essence of his creative activity. Stelliarsky appeared to be a colorful figure of a shtetl Jew whom the Soviet government saved from oppression and humiliation and provided with the necessary benefits. This, they say, is possible only thanks to the Soviet system, Stalin's concern for musical talents, etc. But pedagogical fame actually came to Stelliarsky earlier, even in pre-revolutionary times, when under difficult conditions, he had to defend his ideals. That's Goldenshteyn in the book. Now, the book was ready by 1939 and offered to a publisher in Kiev. Goldenshteyn writes, "They promised to study it, but after a long wait, I received a message that the publishing house preferred a book by two journalists, Niedzwiecki and Yukhnov, in which Stelliarsky's life path is described in language more accessible to the general reader, and a correct political assessment of his life is given. It turns out that I did not take into account Stelliarsky's speeches at party meetings in my book, did not show what role the Communist Party allegedly played in creating the most favorable conditions for his activities. Indeed, I did not emphasize the role of Stalin in the activities of Soviet musicians. I did not mention the fact of the construction of a magnificent building for the Stelliarsky School, etc. Many of
So
those things,
not
but
basically in the in his version, he needed to butter up the authorities a little bit more, so they passed him over.
although he didn't really, he was able to bypass this a bit because it's set in the past. The novel ends before he even starts studying classical music. He's on his way to Warsaw to start
Right.
studying classical music. And that's the future. That's why it's called Klezmer, because it's basically about his Klezmer days. Although even that's not, it's not really true, completely true what he wrote. Quite definitely not. Then came the war. Anyway, I didn't mention the fact that what I was going to say is that many of these things are actually true, but Goldenshteyn really didn't, that's not what he wanted to write about. And in my in-depth study of Stelliarsky pedagogical system was considered a kind of formalism. In a word, according to the opinion of the publishing house, my book was addressed to a narrow circle of specialists. I had to rework the book, including quotations from the works of the classics of Marxism-Leninism. Now, after that came the war, and Stelliarsky's school was evacuated to Sverdlovsk and Goldenshteyn with it. At the time of Stelliarsky's death of natural causes in 1944, they were again planning to publish the book. In 1946, it was accepted by the Moscow music publisher Muzgiz. The type was set, and it had already been given 2 proofreads. And Goldenshteyn explains, only the coveted decision was awaited, signed for publication. But then a wave of anti-Semitism swept the country. It turns out the authorities were convinced that in the USSR, anti-patriots, cosmopolitans, and Zionists were operating. They began to persecute famous Soviet theater experts, writers, and poets, especially of Jewish nationality, and the Yiddish theaters were closed. In the eyes of the anti-Semites, Piotr Stelliarsky now looked like a typical Jewish figure who should not be widely exposed to the people. I got a call on the phone from Vishnevskaya. She urgently asked me to come to the publishing house. The head of the cultural sector of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Boris Mikhailovich Yaroslavsky, had told her that the book about Stelliarsky could not be published at the present time, and the type must be broken up as soon as possible. He also advised me to destroy even the drafts of my manuscript. In a word, no traces of the book should exist.
Amazing.
Finally, in 1967, I emigrated to Israel. There I met the wonderful cellist and composer Joachim Stuchevsky. I'm sure many of you know about. We talked about Stelliarsky. I told him the story of my book. It needs to be rewritten as soon as possible, Stuchevsky said. But accidentally meeting David Oistrakh in West Germany and learning from him that someone in Moscow was already writing a book about Stelliarsky, I decided to wait. In the meantime, I continued to accumulate new materials. I communicated with the oldest students of Stelliarsky living in the USA, Israel, and England. So the idea of writing a version of the book matured. Fortunately, the notebooks with records of personal conversations with Stelliarsky had survived. They were brought to me at the request of my relatives by Soviet artists who came to Hamburg on tour.
Amazing.
So now he had the ability to rewrite the book. And by the way, I want to explain that Goldenshteyn only stayed in Israel 1 year because he got a position. He was given a position as professor at the Hochschule for music in Hamburg. So the last 20 years of his life, he was living in Hamburg, Germany. Goldenshteyn tells us that he was unable to find out much about Stelliarsky's relatives because Stelliarsky didn't want to talk about them and would even get annoyed when he asked. But he did at least find out that Pesi or Pini Stelliarsky was the youngest, not of 4 children as in the novel, but of 13 children. He was born 30th November 1870. All other sources give the year as 1871. But he started playing violin at 3 and was already playing with the band by age 4. In the novel, he was just beginning to play the violin at age 7, and his perfect pitch was not discovered until the evening of the Molever Kompanye, that same day.
Right.
I think that it may be that Drucker raised his age by a few years so that his sisters would be old enough to be married in that sort of condensed various longer time period into one day, which is called, unity of action by Aristotle. Goldenshteyn anecdotally refers to some older brothers and sisters, but the only one named is Mark, who seems to have been one of the oldest. Mark Stelliarsky is described as a great clarinetist. He played in the family Capella, but is never mentioned in the time of Pesi, and is obviously out of the picture in the novel, as the clarinetist there is the son-in-law, Velvel Belfer. From this, we infer that Velvel, if he's really our man, at some point replaced Mark Stelliarsky, which would fit with the fictional Belfer having married into the family. For traces of Belfer in the biography, then, we cannot expect much help from Stelliarsky. Fortunately, at some point in the mid-1930s, Goldenshteyn got to know another person, 30 years younger than Stelliarsky, who could tell him something about the Capella in Lipovitz. Goldenshteyn writes, I remember a conversation I had with the composer Genrikh Ilyich Litinsky, professor at the Moscow Conservatory, who was born in Lipovitz in 1901. In the years of his youth, Litinsky left for Moscow. He studied composition with Reinhold Gleyer at the Moscow Conservatory, graduating with honors. Right after his graduation, he began to teach. In 1933, he was appointed professor. Among his students, of which he had more than 200, many became well-known composers. Litinsky himself wrote quite a bit of good music. It happened to me once to study composition with him. On one occasion, we got to talking, And Litinsky told him, I knew from my parents about the Stelliarsky Kapella. Some of its heirs, that is Heirs, were still around. I remember a wonderful clarinetist from that hometown of mine. I often stood under the windows and listened to him playing, Litinsky recalled. This sounds like a memory of a young boy, and we know that he left Moscow when he was quite young. I mean, he left for Moscow. So since Litinsky was born in 1901, the memory must go back to a time not very long before Belf made his recordings. Now, if Litinsky's clarinetist was indeed Belf, or rather Belfer, and he had inherited the leadership of the band, that certainly fits with his being Shlomo Stelliarsky's son-in-law and Pesach Stelliarsky's brother-in-law. In other words, the Belf Kapella of Lipovitz seems to have been the successor to the Stelliarsky family Kapella. Goldenshteyn also records more background information from a conversation between Litinsky and Stelliarsky. He writes, once in the foyer of the Great Hall of the Moscow Conservatory, the Landsleit, Stelliarsky and Litinsky encountered each other. Now remember, they were in different cities, so they didn't often meet. They found they had many acquaintances in common, but they talked more about their shtetl, Lipovitz, yes, the river Sob, the noisy marketplace, yes, and also the synagogue where such wonderful cantors sang. At one time, Stelliarsky's father, Shlomo, was the central figure in the musical life of shtetl Lipovitz. He was a virtuoso trumpet player. He knew how to draw from this instrument sounds both quiet and plaintive. And he also headed the family Kapella that he had inherited. If someone died in the city, they turned to Shlomo with a request to accompany the deceased on his last journey. He found suitable musicians and put together an orchestra. But he loved weddings more because there was room to open up. Putting the mouthpieces of his trumpet to his swollen lips, Shlomo carried the klezmers away with his playing. Shlomo also had a beautiful tenor voice. He knew many songs, Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian, even Armenian. It was not a big voice, but beautiful, accurate, slightly husky. He also knew how to play other instruments. And by the way, in it, he also mentions that one of Shlomo's daughters sang with the band, which is very interesting, I think, and that she married a rich man. Doesn't give her a name, but, and he also mentions that one of his sons left to join a military style band, which could have been Mark. I don't know, but it could have, really don't know. Mm-hmm. Okay, but now there's one Belf recording that's a special favorite of mine, and I think it gives the best idea of what the band might have sounded like in the old days that we're talking about. It's not a dance number, but a moralische, followed by just a snippet of a dance. Perhaps for that reason, they do without the usual piano. The accompaniment sounds a lot like wind instruments, but I think it's actually just two violins, just the two violins, plus another instrument that may be a trombone or euphonium. It makes you realize just how much the inclusion of the piano affected the overall sound of such a small ensemble. And in my opinion, not for the better, but so we're going to hear now.
Hear this. Yeah, we're going to listen to the Plach Evrea. And before I spin that disc, you know, what I'm hearing you say is that you are very confident at this point, and we're going to hear some more evidence, but from the evidence that you've put together so far, you're very confident that the Belf in the Belf Orchestra is the brother-in-law of Stelliarsky, and that this is the band. He's the band leader that's being recorded on these sides. Is that right?
Yes, although I'm not sure if there's another question, of course, is whether this band is really his shtetl band. We'll talk about that a little later.
But you think the clarinetist for sure is this guy? You're staking that claim.
I could be wrong. I'm going to bring some more evidence, and you be the judge.
All right, but let's listen first, because this is a magnificent piece, and we are going to listen to it in its entirety because it doesn't repeat.
Yeah.
Yep.
So e-
Yep.
even the clarinet itself sounds quite different. And I think that's probably because the placement of the instruments could be much better with respect to the horn because of not needing the piano. So you can really hear probably what much better what he really sounded like.
Yeah.
Now, there's also the story about how the real Pacey it got into classical music, which is quite different from what happened in the novel. And just to go very quickly, in the biography, he explains that one day when he'd been playing just with his father's band since he was little. One day when he was 14, that's what Goldenshteyn says, but it's probably 15 or 16, from because of certain discrepancies in some other things. He found an unexpected opportunity to play for Stanislaw Bartkiewicz, a celebrated Polish violinist. The band had finished a grueling 2-week wedding gig in Vinica, 45 kilometers, about 28 miles west of Lipovitz. They were all exhausted. His father became ill and needed to recover. For once, Stelliarsky was unable to keep his eye on the boy. Bartkiewicz was on tour and about to play a concert in Vinica. A cantor who knew Bartkiewicz took Pacey to the concert. Pacey, who until then had limited exposure to classical music, was entranced. The cantor offered to introduce him to Bartkiewicz the following day and suggested Pacey play for him. He played his repertoire of mazurkas and other Polish dances. Bartkiewicz was so impressed with Pacey, despite his klezmer's technique, that he invited him to come study with him at the Warsaw Conservatory, where he had just been appointed professor of violin, very recently before that. So the only thing lacking was money. Up to that point, Pacey had only played with the band and his father guarded him jealously because he was a star attraction. Stelliarsky did not want to lose him and refused to contribute any money for his studies, but the cantor who had introduced him to Bartkiewicz, and Bartkiewicz himself helped. After his studies in Warsaw, where he seems to have remained about 6 or 7 years, Stelliarsky had become a classical violinist. Although he never had a solo career. His technique was compared to the really, hotshot violinists, it was somewhat limited. But he moved with, huh?
There's a question from Joel that sort of has to do with this moment that you're talking about. He asks, isn't the Warsaw bit in part 2 of Klezmer published in 1976?
The Warsaw bit is, but not exactly. What happens is he first goes to Warsaw and is disappointed. It doesn't work out for him. So he doesn't get anywhere. And then he by his grit and determination, he goes back. And this time, he goes back with some kind of that he is going to study. And he also goes back with an invitation from a lady, a wealthy lady, that she's going to help him out. And he goes to her place. But this is the very end of the book. It doesn't go beyond that. He still hasn't even met Stelliarsky yet in the book. And the name not Stelliarsky, Bartkiewicz.
Yeah.
And I don't think the name Bartkiewicz even appears in the novel. But By the way, though, in the biography, that episode of meeting a guy on the train who gives him some important information about Warsaw and offers to help him, find his direction, where to find this lady, that also appears in a different form, of course. But so that's an example of something that in the novel that was true. But the
Right.
novel does not talk really anything about his experience, his actual experiences once he's learning at the conservatory. Okay, now the final document is a government document, and it's what it is. It's the Kiever Gubernia list of eligible voters for the election of the Second Duma in 1907. In order to be eligible to vote, one had to be a male of at least 25 years of age and to own or lease some real property or commercial goods, which is proved by a record of tax payment. So this document shows a Leba Shloimovich Stelliarsky in the city of Lipovitz, who had paid his apartment tax. So from this, we see that Leb was a real person.
And this is what year again?
1907.
1907.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, the population of Lipovitz, the Jewish population of Lipovitz in 1897 was a little over 4,000. And the list also shows a Volk Mendelovich Bilfer. Now, variations of names. It's practically the same as Belfer. And the Volk means wolf, and wolf in Yiddish, wolf. And Velvel is the diminutive of wolf. So this seems to be the same person also. He had also paid his apartment tax. So he was a real person, and his father's name was Mendel. Gedalia Kneifel does not appear, but perhaps the Kneifels had moved away. Nor does Schleime appear, but probably he was no longer alive by 1907. Because when Schleime, we figured that he probably was no younger than in his early 40s in that opening scene, and he'd fathered 12 children before Pacey. So he could have been born no later than about 1837, I figured. If Belfer or Belfer was about 20 in that scene, that opening scene in the novel, he would have been born in the later 1850s and thus would have been in his later 50s when he made his recordings. So Stelliarsky really did have an older brother, Leib, and we only learned that from the novel because he didn't want to tell Goldenshteyn about his brothers and sisters. That's another thing of truth in the novel. However, his father's name really was Schleimer. The town he lived in really was Lipovitz, and his brother-in-law's name really was Belfer. At least the chances of that not being so, I think, are pretty small. The fact that Leib Stelliarsky and Wolf Belfer both paid apartment tax shows that in 1907 they did not own their own houses, which fits with the information that Belf did not buy a house in his hometown until 1912 with money from the Serena recordings. And by the way, this is how historical evidence does work. I mean, in other words, no one of these things could have proved anything, but by the convergence, the chances of all of this being a coincidence are very, very small. And that's kind of how science works too.
Right. You pile the evidence together and then you sort of eliminate the other options. And so Drucker was a journalist and who had interviewed this Stelliarsky figure many times before he wrote this novel. And so he might have heard about these other relatives, even though when it came to the biography part of biography writing, he didn't want to talk about those people to the biographer. Is that?
Well, I think, remember he said he was a politicheskaya kukla.
Yeah, he's a puppet,
And
right?
this was an example of it. I mean, he obviously did talk about his relatives, and Drucker used them in a certain way. And I'm not saying it was like a terrible way or anything, but
Mhm.
it wasn't really the truth. And there actually was something else too. And I will get to that later, but it tells you something about it is directly related to Belf, actually, or Belfer.
Right.
But
So now the last piece of this, if you've identified the humans, the people, you've identified the guy, the clarinetist, the band that he's inherited here. So how did he get this gig? And how did then he become the most, one of the most recorded of all of the instrumental Jewish bands in the European discography? Like that's kind of the last piece, or one of the last pieces here.
it's one of the last pieces. I had a couple of other pieces just before
Let's
that, though.
let's
If I have
let's get let's do it. Let's get them.
um,
We're at an hour and 15 now,
okay,
so
we're doing pretty good, I think.
good.
Another question is there any other record of Belfer as a klezmer family? And yes, there is. In fact, his name was Wolf Belfer, but he wasn't the same person. But he was about the same age. Uh, he was from Korsun, at the other end of Kiev province, Kiev Gubernია, 220 kilometers, about 135 miles to the east. And he was a trumpet player. He was born in 1861. So I said that I think Belf was born in the later 1850s, our Belf. So he's maybe 5 years younger than our Belf, and he emigrated to New York with his family in January 1914, just about the time the other Wolf Belfer was making his last recordings. This Wolf Belfer died in the Bronx in 1934. In 1940, his eldest son, Abrasha, is a violinist in the New York Philharmonic, as he had been since the 1920s. The next son, Joe Belfer, is a musician in movie theater orchestras. And the youngest, Phil, is a popular dance band leader. In the 1930s, Phil Belfer conducted the Gotham Dance Orchestra featuring the famous trombonist Harry Raderman, son of a klezmer from Proskurov. But their relation to the Lipovitz Belfer is not known. I don't know exactly, but they probably were related.
Yeah.
If the Belf records were so popular, why? This is a question that Mike Aylward asked me once. Why was virtually nothing written about Belf? Well, because the Belf records, first of all, they were extremely popular, and a fact emphasized by the pseudo Belf knockoffs on the Stella label that were made also in 1912. And Simon, this brings back memories from when we were writing to each other many years ago, and I needed to explain this. The records were on the market less than 3 years. And Belf's fame was of a peculiar kind. He was the first klezmer to become famous through recordings. To all appearances, he had, prior to the recordings, nothing other than a local renown, nor did he ever become known in any other way than through the recordings. And then the war intervened, followed by a period of great political instability and pogroms, which put an end to his recording career, if not his life. This was followed by a period of radical social and political change in Europe in general and Russia in particular. So the subsequent fate of Velvel Belfer is unknown. The war ended his recording career, and the effects of the war and subsequent pogroms may very possibly have ended his life. This is a quote: the Jews of Lipovitz were hit hard by World War I and the calamities of revolutionary years and civil war. And this wasn't because the Germans killed Jews, but because at least 40 Lipovitz Jews lost their lives in pogroms staged by various warring parties. On 7th April 1921, the Vorwärts in New York reported the names of 33 slaughtered in a pogrom in Lipovitz, although the name of Belfer is not among them. A week later, Vorwärts, 16th August 1921, reported in addition 1,180 who suffered from the pogrom in Lipovitz, and noted 100 refugees staying in the town from other places. An aid committee supplied 10,000 pud, of wood for the sufferers. A pud is 16.38 kilograms or 36 pounds. And there were special provisions for 190 children. So in the Gramophone In piece, he's described as an ordinary klezmer. But if he really was Shlomo Stelliarsky's son-in-law, it would make sense that he'd inherit the leadership of the Lipovitz band. Now we come to the question that you asked about how did he get the gig in the first place? Well, the story, as you know, is that Temple, manager of Serena, discovered Belf, but it's still not clear how, out of all the unknown Kapellmeisters in Ukraine, he happened to pick Belf. We don't know, but what we do know is that Stelliarsky had connections in the musical world of Warsaw, and that he was particularly likely to have been in contact with the Warsaw violin community in or just prior to 1912, because in that year, he took the major step of opening his own violin school for children in Odessa. This was before the Soviet one. Mm-hmm. Stelliarsky's teacher, Stanislav Bartsevich, by the way, recorded on the Gramophone concert label, the famous recording, actually, the slow movement or canzonetta from the Tchaikovsky violin concerto, recorded in Warsaw in 1905. Bartsevich, by the way, actually did the Polish premiere of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto in 1893, and that's Stelliarsky was there at that time. Probably, almost certainly, was in the audience, or maybe even more than that. He was probably perhaps learning some things about the concerto while Bartsevich was working it up. Bartsevich never recorded on Serena, but as one of Poland's most famous violinists, certainly was known to the firm. And as for the Amor sessions, the Gramophone Amor sessions of 1914, we don't know exactly how they came about, but Gramophone was the label that Bartsevich recorded for. But considering Belf's commercial success, he perhaps needed no introduction by that time anyway. In any case, it was a wise decision because Amor was a subsidiary of Gramophone and had better international distribution than Serena, and the technical quality of the recordings is better. 25 years ago, I documented 10 Belf sides on Amor, but since then, Michael Alpert found a total of 32, which we know, thanks to detailed engineers' reports, were all recorded on March 5th and 7th, 1914. Unfortunately, the Amors are much rarer than the Serenas, probably because, as Michael suggested, they were released such a short time before the outbreak of the First World War. But here is one we're going to play for you, Chaban, one of these Amor recordings that was made on March 7th, 1914. And incidentally, March 7th, 1914 was a Saturday, so they weren't Shomrei Shabbos.
Okay.
It does sort of go along with the novel.
Amazing. Okay, so hold on 1 second. Once again, I'm going to start this right as it hits its stride. I have to share the sound first. Oops, sorry. Let me share the sound. I'm going to start this right as we get to the second time through.
Okay, so here's another inference. If Belf recorded 32 sides in 2 days, March 5th and 7th, 1914, that's 16 a day. Since we now know of approximately 76 or 78 Sirena sides at a similar rate, this would have taken 4 or at most 5 days of recording.
I have a
Since the
question
first
for you. Hold up, I have one. This is I'm going to insert this question from Michael. As regards to the Shabbat recordings, does it take into account the difference between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars at the time?
Good point.
Ah, good point.
But I'm not sure
Michael.
which calendar actually was used by the engineer. That's another. Or do you know,
Or the
Mike?
band, or most importantly, by the band, I suppose.
Well, no, I mean, no, I mean,
Oh yeah, right. The engineer's report. Right.
but it's what date you call it. That's the thing. It's a very good question. All right.
Okay, sorry, as you were.
Let's see. We know that, okay, we know of approximately 76 or 78 Sirena sides. At a similar rate, this would have taken 4 or at most 5 days of recording. Since the first bells were released at the beginning of April 1912, and since by June 1912, Belf had made enough money to buy a house, this strongly suggests that all the Sirena recordings were made within a week in the early part of 1912, and that he was paid a large lump sum for all of them as soon as they were finished. By the way, what you're saying before, yes, they sold a lot of records, but I don't think they were making royalties.
Right.
They got paid. That's
Right.
it.
They just got paid. Yeah. I think that's pretty common. I don't, yeah.
Right. The money,
They got paid for this
and
mission. That's
you know,
it.
he was not going to command the same rates as Sirota, but he obviously was pretty decently paid. And Serena was known for that. You know,
Right.
I was mentioned in that same column. I didn't read all of the column. Anyway, I should add that a recent discovery, I think by Kurt last March, if not earlier, there's a record, there's 2 sides, Kozachok or Piasavoy and Ukrainsky Kozachok, credited to Ukrainian orchestra under the direction of Lebedenko. They're actually by Belf.
Right.
You can tell that, but first by the catalog number, which fits exactly into the sequence of releases from June or July 1912, Belf releases. And the sound also is unmistakable, but we don't have time to play it now.
Yeah, I think we're gonna do the thing that we've done in the past, which is that we'll make a Google Drive that everybody has access to that has the recordings that we've been listening to here, so everybody will be able to go back and listen to them at leisure. And for those of you who are new to the series, welcome. And just because we've made these similar Google Drives available for all of our previous sessions, and so we'll go ahead and send along the links to the 3 other previous Google Drives and the notes that go with them so that you can listen into the stuff that we've been learning about and hearing about in previous sessions. So,
okay, so and by the way, I'll just insert here that I mentioned before that there were also 18 recordings on the Extraphone label. Extraphone was located in Kiev, and these releases, they were all released in July 1912. Unfortunately, because we had not one of them has surfaced, and that was like right before World War I started. So that's too bad. I also think that of these 32 Amors, only the ones that I found in 1995 probably were the only ones released.
yeah.
Unfortunately, but because again, they were released very, very soon before World War I started. On the Belf recordings, we always hear one violin doubling the clarinet with a lesser degree of ornamentation, and another violin playing second, chords and rhythm, and a piano. The second and piano, we could, we'll have to really think about that, but they sometimes show a lack of familiarity with the music. But the doubling violin, though, although filling a modest role, shows great skill and great familiarity with the music. as if this person at least was an actual member of the Lipovitz Kapelle. So the group that recorded is not Belf's, probably not, well, it's not the whole band anyway, I don't think, because first of all, a shtetl band would probably, in Russia, would probably be larger. At least, I would say at least 6 or 8. And, they would have to all be transported to the recording studio in another city, whether it was probably Warsaw, or of course the extra phones were recorded in Kiev. But anyway, that violinist, I'd say it would be rash to assert, but not unreasonable to propose that violinist was Leib Stelliarsky,
Amazing.
For reasons I gave before. What eventually became of Belf, there's a kind of an irony in that he was, while he was completely forgotten in Soviet times, such important clues come from 2 books written about a man regarded as hero of Soviet culture, namely Stelliarsky. Yeah, I think the irony is summed up in the fact that Velvel Belfer, who in the Soviet novel is bewailed by his father-in-law, is not, along with the rest of his sons, as unlikely to have a bright future. There's no, that's part of the socialist realism.
Right.
By happy accident, actually became quite wealthy in a very short time in a very capitalist way. I'm not trying to be ideological here, but because what happened with Belf was not at all typical for Klezmer, but it did happen. And thanks to Belf's complete historical oblivion, even in his home country, I doubt this was known to either Ymer Drucker or Michael Goldenshteyn, especially because, but it was certainly known to Stelliarsky, and that may be one of the reasons why he did not want to talk about his relatives.
Amazing. Oh,
Even though-
wow. Yes, of course. Of course.
Even though it only came about by luck, this theme was the exact opposite of what the socialist realism of the novel was meant to bring out. In Goldstein's words, Stelliarsky appeared to be a colorful figure of a shtetl Jew whom the Soviet government saved from oppression and humiliation and provided with the necessary benefits. This, they say, is possible only thanks to the Soviet system, Stalin's concern for musical talents, etc. And even though pedagogical fame came to Stelliarsky earlier, that was omitted in the novel. As Stelliarsky was well aware, for the journalist, he was a politicheskaya kukla, political puppet. And he was aware of this because he obviously had told more about his family to one of these journalists, Drucker, and knew what would be done with the characters, one of whom was Velvel Belfer. The true story of Stelliarsky did not completely follow the paradigm of socialist realism. But while he and his pupils did receive tremendous support from the Soviet system, his initial transition to classical music had nothing to do with socialism, but with opportunities already opening up to talented Jewish musicians in 19th century Russia. As for Belfer, his success went counter to the paradigm of socialist realism entirely and could not be written about in any Soviet publication. Fortunately for Stelliarsky, no one remembered him anyway.
Wow.
End of my talk.
That's amazing. Oh my God. I mean, Jordan Hersh, as often as he does often, had said that, it put in the chat that his head is literally spinning at 78 RPM right now from all of this information. So this is remarkable. I mean, this is the sort of the second time I'm hearing this story because we kind of went through a lot of it the other day. But it's a staggering amount of detail that you've been able to put together from these various and disparate sources. So I just hats off to you for putting this all together. And thank you for sharing with us. And what I'd like to do now, I'm going to go in the gallery view so I can see everybody who's here. And I think let's open it up to questions. I think there are many. Some have been asked and answered in the chat, but I think let's just start fresh. And if you've got a question, why don't you go ahead and put your hand up so that you'll scooch over in the gallery. Michael Alpert, I see you. Why don't you go ahead and go first? And Ron asked, will the Zoom recording of this session be available in the future? And the answer is yes. It will take us a little while to process them. And but once we do, we'll put them up in the chat. So Michael, can you please?
Excuse me, Michael, you're muted. So
Yeah, mute. Yeah, Michael, unmute yourself.
do you know how to
Unmute.
There you are.
Yeah, there you are.
I am unmuted, as thousands of people have wished over the years. Right. Yeah, Joe, an annoying speculative question really is that, bearing in mind the incredible number of recordings that this little ensemble made, can you account for their obvious popularity to the extent that some companies even invented pseudo-belf orchestras?
Okay, well, because first of all, the market was wide open. There really were not that many. There were a lot of potential customers because there was a growing middle class, Jewish middle class in Russia, in Ukraine, and I just think it just was the right moment. I mean, it did happen. Obviously, they were very popular, and when you say that the imitation of Belf, we don't know we have many of those records, but we don't know the actual identity of the clarinetist who made them and the ensemble. But that shows that they literally couldn't get it. The public just couldn't get enough of this stuff.
Go ahead, Sherry.
Just recently, I came across, I started expanding my collecting to include some accordion bands and other bands that were not specifically Jewish, just, from the surrounding area. And it's really interesting because I found that there are a number of other Stella ripoffs of exactly the same tunes as some of these other bands, which kind of blew my mind because I, say, oh yeah, they ripped off the Belf, but they ripped off a regimental band playing some Russian folk dance tunes, and they ripped off an accordion band. And again, the tunes were the same on both sides as the other, the Sirena recording. So I think they were just mining Sirena in general. So I'm not sure how much we can say it says about Belf particularly, because we don't know that much about Stella as far as I know. What they were doing in general, there's much less information about them than there are about Sirena. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
I see you, Joel. Ruben. Jordan has a question. He has his hand up. And my question is, and I'm just going to throw it out there and we'll circle back to it maybe, is like, so we know that there are bands that are copying Belf, but I'm curious why there weren't other bands under different band leaders entirely who jumped on this bandwagon. But let's put that aside for just you got an answer to that, Jeffrey?
Quick answer. I mean, There obviously were, because my article in 1997 isn't only about Belf.
Right, there are other bands, right?
European recordings of Jewish instrumental folk music, 1911 to 1914. So yeah, there are others, and there are some. Yeah,
some of them are on Chekhov's band.
And by the way,
right.
Mike discovered more, and there's some, like the Chekhov's band, particularly. You should all
We should all own that. We should all own. And speaking of which, if you go to the Gramophone In Focus page, you can go to a direct link to where you can purchase those discs from Honest John's records. So, okay, over to Jordan, who has been patiently waiting.
It's really just a quick question. So you cited that apartment tax record that shows that person we think is Belf in Ivan Lupovitz around when you said 1912.
1907.
1907. So, are there any census or tax records of any kind from that region that show that Belf might even have survived World War I and the subsequent civil wars and the various, the various Russian civil wars and then the Polish-Russian conflicts? Is it not at all possible that at least part of why we don't know that much about him is, or that renown or any fame is because what's to say that he wasn't even someone who survived all the violence in that region Do we have any record of all at all? Census, tax, otherwise?
I'll answer. I'll try to answer that. There, it's a combination of things. One is that there could definitely be more records out there. I'm looking for them now. You know, there can be because now I have a beat on them. Let's put it like that. But also the period that we're going into from World War I to, let's say, even like the first half of the 1920s was an extremely unsettled time in Russia or the Soviet Union, where a lot of people did get killed, and not even them probably were even recorded. It does seem to, I really have no idea what happened to Belf. He was not a young man, and he seems to me a perfect, a sort of a likely target for a pogrom, being fairly wealthy, rather wealthy,
Right. I mean, that's exactly my question.
I don't know. I mean, I hope we can find out, but at least that's, this is the always the difficulty is trying to find the records.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Jeff. Amazing.
Before we turn to Joel Rubin and then after that to Michael Alpert, I'm going to tell Jeanette something that Sherry just put in the chat, that Jeff's previous article about that we're talking about is already posted on our website in the article section, where you can also read a phenomenal article about the Boybrückerkapelle, which is like a whole other topic for another day, but also magnificent detective work and storytelling in that article there. So lots of fun to read there. But Joel, thanks for that question, Jordan. And Joel, you had a question, so why don't you go next? And then I see you, Mesh.
Yeah, not so much questions, but comments, and they're like several different, and I'm probably going to go off on a tangent, so I'll try to stay focused.
That's okay, we're good.
I had like about 3 different pieces of information. One is just going back, and I think I've talked about this with Jeff already, but the veracity of the Drucker book, although it's a work of fiction, I was able to, and this is probably in the 1990s, able to interview on the telephone Chaim Bader, who was I think the former editor of Sovjetisch Heimland. He was living in New York at the time. Unfortunately, I didn't record it, but he was the administrator, I guess, of the Drucker estate. So, and he knew him very well. So we talked a bit about that. And one thing he said was that Drucker was extremely interested in the topic of Klezmer. He said that as far as he knew, he was not related to the Klezmer Drucker family, but I don't know on what basis. But he said that Drucker had maintained a glossary of Klezmer terms, and that he had not only had he interviewed Stelliarsky, but when he was finished with the novel, he went back to Stelliarsky and showed it to him and basically asked for his approval. And he apparently said it was, seemed very realistic or whatever. Speaking of socialist realism. So much for that. I don't know if that adds anything to the veracity of it.
I think that's very interesting because, but it tells me, I didn't know that it's something that I'm very glad to know, that he went back to Stelliarsky. But of course, Stelliarsky had to say that. I mean, he knew the rules of the game, and he knew, so did Drucker. And in that sense, he did do a pretty good job, or maybe a very good job. I mean, and when you mentioned about Klezmer Lushan, not only that, he had obviously researched proverbs about Klezmer, which he uses in the book quite a lot. But and this is one thing that they did in this also in Socialist Realism. They tried to use traditional culture like proverbs and songs, melodies, and to promote, the socialism, the new way.
Well, one other thing I would mention is that Drucker wrote a fictionalized novel about Gusikov, which was published in Sovjetisch Heimland. I've read bits of it. I never had the patience to read the whole thing, but so he was obviously interested in this and had his focus on, like, why would this guy in early in the early Soviet Union even know about Guzikov. So he clearly had his fingers to the.
Well, this topic is really interesting, but I just couldn't go in. That would be a whole
Yeah.
thing in itself about, how the Soviet culture and how they tried to adapt. But it seems to me that Guzikov would have been, why not? Guzikov was quite famous, and he was far enough in the past. He wasn't a political football or hot potato at all. He was somebody who was a progressive. He could be easily defined as in fact, he really was, because he came from a completely Hasidic background, and he was playing for all the crown heads of Europe and playing, Western music and so on. So why not? And that's fair game for Soviet literature. Why not?
So to come back to this question of why were the Belf recordings so popular? I mean, I think this is something that interests all of us, but I think, first of all, we don't know anything about hardly any of these musicians other than the few star klezmer musicians who were documented by Bergovsky or by Stuchevsky or whatever. We really don't often even know their names. So I don't think that's an anomaly with Belf, that we don't know anything about him. But I do think that music struck a nerve, and as Jeff was saying, with this kind of emerging middle classes, because it was so quintessentially small town klezmer, as opposed to, say, the Russian Jewish orchestra that Reiner was posting about a few minutes ago, or any of the Vilna bands that we published on the Chekhov's band, or the Bach's orchestra in Odessa, or the Chernovitz or Civil Capella. All of these were much more urbane, larger, sophisticated bands with, sometimes fancy arrangements and this sort of thing. And the Belf band was very elemental. We don't know, like the question about the pianist and everything is kind of a weird question. But I think that the clarinet and the two violins are working as a unit, and we're probably the nucleus of that band. And that was something that must have just tapped into a nerve. Maybe it was some kind of, collective memory of who knows, childhood or grandparents' memories or whatever.
Well, I've had some experiences with actually relatives of mine who either I visited in Ukraine or came over or emigrated to America in fairly recent times, where I played klezmer music for them, and they just were over the moon. They just loved this to hear it, and they probably didn't hear it very much. I'm sure they didn't, and because it's really it's our their music, and so I think you're making a very, very good point there, about that. It's elemental. It's the real thing. Even though it's too. When I first started, I was wondering, especially, for certain reasons, especially the piano, like you said. But it really is. Overall, it's a very Kleinstädtlich.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mishka, you had a question there, and now I see Michael afterwards. And anybody else who has a question and would like some amplification, please put your hand up so we can see you. But go ahead, Mish.
Yeah, I have three short questions and then a comment about the last point. Phenomenal, Jeffrey, as always, and which relates to actually my first question was that in your 1997 article, which was groundbreaking. I mean, and just a lightning flash as to the existence of this whole recording industry, and the fact that Belf and among other things, all these covers and Belf imitators and so forth, showed that there was just this absolutely an audio industry, not to mention audiophile community that produced Gramophone In Focus, Gramophone In Hersh Rikelman, and so forth. These journals. Didn't that kind of cover of original Belf recordings extend also to all the way up to Taras, the early Taras recordings? Am I remembering that correctly? That a couple of the tunes that Taras did in those first New York sessions seemed to be covers of the Belf versions? Question mark.
I think Joel probably knows more about that than I do.
Yeah.
Joel's just.
Yeah,
Joel's
I don't think those are covers. I think it's close enough, Teplik and Ternovka are close enough geographically. That was the local. I don't think that, maybe some of the Belf repertoire was their own compositions, but a lot of it was just common tunes that everybody know. And I think that was like a Venn diagram. That was like part of the Terrace's early repertoire, probably from his family or from that region, because his versions are quite different. I don't think, and based on because, Andy spent the most time, I guess, and Zev too, I guess, with Terrace. And one of the things was that Terrace never really listened to records that much, apparently. He didn't copy other people's records.
I remember now that Kurt, who unfortunately wasn't able to make this, but he'll be able to see it later, that Kurt was telling me about, he noticed that there was a Schwartz recording where Schwartz did something peculiar, Abe Schwartz, that he did something peculiar that on a Belf record, that Kurt, we think is actually a mistake. And that, it's things like that where they do something very specific that was done on a Belf recording where you might be able to
say,
I know
that's a
about this.
cover.
I know about this. This is Mechatonim Tanz, Abe
Huh?
Schwartz. This is Mechatonim Tanz by Abe Schwartz, and it's Urabitz Urabina. And Abe Schwartz does a little introduction, which goes da 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 da.
That's right.
And the Belf clarinet tries to do this on the record. Unfortunately, the violins have forgotten it, and they just launch straight into the tune. and so the first 4 bars are a complete shambles as they do these contra melodies. And the slightly interesting thing is that the knockoff version, called Uravina, does the introduction perfectly correctly. So they had access to this piece in a version which didn't depend on Belf. I've always wondered where Abe Schwartz got this introduction from.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. Did I get it backwards then? Or that Abe Schwartz?
Abe Schwartz does an introduction and Belf cocks it up, is the short version.
Yeah, but I think that was just another section of the tune that.
No, it's a 4-bar introduction. I've got it on a PDF. I'm looking at it, but I don't know how to send it to you.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about, because we've been, Kurt, who's had to dip out, and Jeff and Michael, and I think and a couple other people were on this. That there's in the Stella version, the knockoff version has this section in it, whether it's an introduction
it's a 4-bar
or not, I don't know.
Yeah,
But,
it is. It's a 4-bar introduction. Just happens once at the beginning.
Simon, which one was that in the list of 41 tunes?
Sorry?
Which one was that you were talking about?
In
your list of
Kurt's
41
Belf, in the Belf originals, it's called Rabina.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
In any case, I think
Abe Schwartz's version is Mechatonim Tanz.
I think the question of how Abe Schwartz acquired repertoire is another question entirely, because as far as we know, he didn't come from a klezmer family, and yet he had this huge repertoire of tunes. Yeah. So he may very well have been listening to other people's recordings, transcribing them, doing all kinds of things. We really don't know at this point.
Simon, perhaps what we can do is after this session, you and I can email a little bit, and we'll add this PDF. We'll build out this little story, and we'll put some links in there to the Abe Schwartz version, and point to where this Urabina is found, so that people can kind of track that down and listen for themselves. Mesh, I see you. I saw your hand fluttering to get to the rest of your questions, and I'd love to do that. And then I want to play. We've been here amazingly for 2 hours, and I want to spin the second new track, because we haven't even talked about the tracks that we listened to. So Mesh, let's get to you, and then let's listen to the other, the Wallachian, or the Wallachian Fantasia, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, Mesh.
Okay. Yeah, I know my hand was just fluttering in terms of giving a thumbs up to everything that was being said there. Joel, I wasn't suggesting that these were Belf compositions. I thought there was actually more of a correspondence, as was mentioned before, that we could hear that like, oh, he has to have taken that from the Belf recording. It was, he does this little flourish or whatever. But yeah, of course, common repertoire. I thought there was a closer correspondence. The other things I wanted to ask Jeffrey is there any difference between the original publication in the text of the original publication of Klezmer by Irma Drucker and the 1976 version, or are they just basically reprints of the same?
There is a difference, but the one that I know that the 1976 one is longer. And I think maybe Joel gave a clue as to, I haven't really compared them throughout, but it seems to be one of the differences is that there's more about Warsaw in the later one. And I think that's probably because if you think about it, when this book was published in 1940, Poland was like, it was the eastern part of Poland was occupied by the Soviet Union. And I think there were a lot of constraints about what they wanted to say about Poland. And actually they don't, so, better like not say very much.
Better not touch it. Yeah.
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have the 1976 one, but I didn't really.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. And I don't have the 1941. I have looked at it, but I didn't really read the whole thing. So do you have any more to say about that, Joel? Oh, where's Joel?
Joel is.
No, and not really. Wasn't able to compare them at the time I was working through. I also had only the 1976 version.
Oh, well, okay.
Do we know where Drucker's archive is? I mean, it is, you mentioned his collection of Klezmer Loschen and so forth, or
Well, Chaim Bader, I don't know if he ended up giving his stuff to Yivo or what. He's not alive anymore.
Yeah. Okay. But Bader would have it. Is that your understanding? Would have had it?
That was my understanding, was that he was the administrator of Drucker's papers, whatever was remained of them.
Right. Okay, well, just a couple of comments. The one, in terms of, the popularity of Belf and what's, very astutely been said about, that this was, the material and the sound was quintessential and connected with so much memory and depth for people. Just to remind folks that, in 1912, 1914, shtetl culture was considered by many to be dying already then. People, huge numbers of people were emigrating, et cetera, et cetera. It's why, it's one of the main reasons the Ansky expeditions happened in the first place.
Right.
And so, that's for sure. This was like, capturing something that people were concerned was fading too. And I just want to mention that my takeaway quote from this today, among the many great things that have been said, it was rash to assert, but not unreasonable to propose. That one's going in the book, right? Thank you all. Thanks so much for this, and to be continued. To be continued,
but before I hope you stay, Mish, and listen. Let's listen to the Wallachian fantasy, and then we'll listen to the Wallachian fantasy, and then I'm gonna spin just a little bit of the very beginning of the first one so we can get it back in our brains. Okay, without further. Amazing. Oh, oh, oh. So great. Do we want to pause for a minute and just talk about this? This is a cool tune. Joel Rubin has pointed out that this is a skoczna that is found in the Berogowski Jewish instrumental folk music, possibly number 40 or something, which just tells you about who is in this room and how amazing everybody is. And I really love that Dan Karkner also mentioned that there's this recording is reminiscent of Tittenschneider. And I would agree with that. I see Bob Blacksburg has his hand up, so go for it, Bob.
My gut reaction right away is this feels much more tasteful as clarinet playing than some of the recordings that we first learned from the Belf world, with the high chirps and the clarinet placement kind of so far from the microphone. But I mean, that may not be fair, but at least that's a gut reaction.
There's almost a polka-like quality also, like in some of those parts. And like, it reminds me, there's like these sort of, they sound almost German, like Schuhplattler type tunes. There's a bunch of these in the Kisselhoff collections as well. So I see Sherry's got her hand up.
Yeah, I didn't hear the doubled fiddle. I just heard clarinet and accompaniment, which is really unusual, and possibly one of the things that makes it sound neater, or tidier, I should say.
Tidier, yeah, I like that.
Because it's one of the few solo pieces
Yeah.
that was recorded. And it's interesting, it shows here a much more closer connection of Belf to actually studied clarinet technique, which is, I think, what Bob was trying to get at, which shows that these guys had multiple modes of, nuance in terms of how to play this music, depending on the repertoire.
And so then, and when they're choosing to play Jewish, they're choosing to play Jewish. And when he's choosing to play a more classical style, that's in his toolkit.
Well, no, I think this is just a different type of composition. These kinds of sort of classically influenced pieces that, to some extent sound like they're coming out of an exercise book. I mean, they're great tunes, but basically the moves that they do, the arpeggiations, all those kinds of things could be coming out of a violin method book or something like that. That just shows what, oh no, I'm losing my train of thought. It's kind of late here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's basically. So I think I wouldn't say Jewish, not Jewish.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Actually,
it's
right.
a different mode of sort of Jewish consciousness. It's generational difference.
Yeah, and Hannah Ochner, Hannah Ochner has noted in the chat that the source is Hershfield, who is a violinist. Is that right, Hannah?
Yes, according to Bergovsky.
So there you are, arpeggiated.
I think Hannah and I are looking at the same exact page.
Yeah.
Nice
Jeff?
to have a spiral bind. Number 50.
Getting back to what we were just talking about, the more der Heubener style or something of this, I wonder if this is, I don't know what the title is in Bergovsky, but it sounds to me like this might be a mazel tov for a more, more distinguished or wealthy person at a wedding.
More refined.
Yeah.
Bergovsky just says Skochna.
Skochna, but that doesn't. I mean, there are two different things because Skochna is a genre, and Mazel Tov is a function. So there's no conflict. You could call it one or the other. But it seems like that. I mean, it reminds me a bit of that. This is also Bergovsky, another one. Da-da-dum, bum 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, although that's not as fast. But or there. Does anybody remember a flute tune that was recorded?
That was the next one. That's the next one in Bergovsky. It does have that same jaunt. Bum ba ba da ba da ba da ba da ba dum ba da ba da ba da ba da ba dum da 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 ba da ba da ba da 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 da. Yeah, that's number 50.
That one, but there's also that also. I'm thinking of a flute tune, and I don't remember the name of the guy who recorded. It wasn't Kosh. It was recorded in America, and it's quite elaborate. It's very elaborate, and with chromatic scales, and it reminded me. Wasn't exactly. Yeah.
That's what reminded me, because the chromatic.
Yeah.
It is the.
Yeah.
It is that. Chayzen.
Yeah, it's Harry Kandel's orchestra with a flute soloist.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. I didn't know you were here, but nice to see you.
The association that my mind went to was actually to not only kind of, I mean, this all stuff is all related, not only sort of polka but the classical angle to me, and the etude like stuff is also to me very typical of the Romanian light classical kind of repertoire that was so strong also in a lot of, especially the more virtuosic Jewish repertoire. I mean, things like this is a Serba, but that Leon Schwartz played, but yeah, and also the cascade of notes that, I mean, this being in that kind of two, it was very Romanian to me, and to me it's not such a wonder that it's called Walochische Fantasia or Wallachian fantasy or anything. This is all very much of a piece.
And by cascading, you also mean, do you mean also the chromaticism in the melody line?
No, also the arpeggiation too. Yeah. Whether it's chromatic or arpeggiated, it's still to me very, especially the major parts, very Romanian.
Because the chromaticism is not just the ornament notes, but actually the main melody line. Also, I think lends some support to your thesis.
Both labels are subtitled Romanian dance. Both sides.
Uh-huh.
I see Ron. Oh, go ahead, Joel. And then Ron has his hand up, so I want to turn to him. But go ahead, Joel, and finish that thought.
No, I was just going to say, so this was one of the points I wanted to make before about the whole Romanian, right, Belf's Romanian orchestra, and what Jeff wrote about in his first article about the, virtuoso performer of Romanian Oriental melodies or Oriental Romanian melodies. This was clearly, although there were some recordings made by non-Jewish musicians under a similar moniker, but basically, I think this was understood as Jewish. I mean, it's quite clear, like if you look at the titles of Belf's tunes, as Jeff was saying, that it's all in Yiddish and Hebrew. This was just understood as like a code, just like in the Soviet Union, Moldavian was often a code for Jewish.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say about these chromaticisms and stuff, what Adrian was pointing out and stuff is that this could point to a single composer, that these 3 or 4 or 5 skochnas that we know are coming from Stempanu, for example, who we've seen cited in the Kisselhoff manuscript or the Makonovetsky manuscript, or Podotzer, or some other one of these other sort of top line klezmers who churned these things out, and that was their signature lick or something.
Right.
We don't know, but that's
Right.
possible. We'd need a much bigger body of material.
Purpose. Right. So let's get to Ron. I see Adrian, you've got yourself unmuted, and then we'll do that question. I want to turn to the Oleandra really quickly so we can talk about that because that's interesting as well. So go ahead, Ron.
Oh, I'm considering passing. I'm so far. This is so far beyond me. I mean, I'm totally out of my depth in this. But just my gut reaction, listening to that last recording, is that that kind of sound, which Christina, you said, oh, sounds Polish, usually was called Bohemian, actually, in the classical world. And I don't know. I have no idea if that has any application here, if it's at all relevant. But since I had my 2 seconds here,
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, and Joel is completely right to sort of call me out between the difference between Jewish and not Jewish. And I think what I said badly was that this one we're listening to does have a more sort of classical approach, you know, in the sound and the tonality, you know, and the more Jew. What I was maybe should have said was like more Jewish with the chirps and the creks and stuff like that. But Bohemian, we'll take it. Let's listen to a little bit of the other one just for a moment to refresh ourselves and see what that turns up for us.
That sounds very like the tune you played at the beginning of the talk.
It is the tune that we played at the beginning of the talk.
Well, that would explain it.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. Yeah, I wanted to give everybody a chance to sort of tune into that again and get it back in their mind so we can. I asked everybody to reserve their comments. And I see that people are having to. Oh, sorry, never mind. Yeah, what do we got here? What do we think? Go, Jeff. You're it.
I'm just going to say, for one thing, I recognize at least the first strain. Was it a Taris recording?
That's the
It's similar.
similar. It's
But
different, but
one
it's
thing I'd
similar.
say I'd throw out about this tune is I think it's very old. It's interesting because it's entirely in minor. It has no modulations whatsoever, and it's mostly, I think it's all entirely 8-bar sections except for the 4-bar insertion before the C section. This is extremely unusual. I mean, it's very typical, but this particular format of having exactly that thing happen in all 3 sections is more like the tune Jeff's talking about, but that's in the mode with the raised fourth, which is much more typical to have little modulation and this sort of thing. But the minor tunes, if you had 3 sections, almost always one of them goes either to the 4 or to the 3, and this doesn't go anywhere. So my guess is it's very old. But I don't know.
Cool. I got stuck on. Well, I shouldn't just talk.
Go for it. Go. Now we're in open discussion land. We're all
Okay.
good. Go for it.
I thought because of the way the pattern went, put that into minor, in a sense, and you had this recurring theme in this tune. It was so similar. If you just put the different harmony, put it in minor instead of major, and you got it.
Well, and what you just sang was the opening share from Chevrisa.
Yeah.
You know, and we lost Zev somehow. I don't know. I was going to ask him about the oleandra because I think he you know, there's a pile of them, a small pile of them in the in Jewish instrumental folk music.
Yeah, he said he had to go. He was late.
Okay, Jeff, do you have your hand up there?
No, I was trying to ward off my dog.
Totally. But yeah, Joel, your point are very well taken. That it doesn't. I hear you about that. It doesn't go. There's no modulations. You know. It's a cool tune. What you got, Sherry?
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, when I put the record on to listen to it, I listened to that side first. I'm really glad I did, because I think if I'd started with the other side, I might have questioned whether it was actually Balf, just because that was so different. But this is clearly the sound that we know and love.
Yeah. What you got, Mish?
Christina, what were you going to say about Oleandra?
Well, I was going to ask Zev, but Zev has left the building, so I can't ask him. But I think he talks about them a little bit in his book, and I know that it's a form we see in the Romanian material as well. And I don't know a ton about them, and I keep forgetting which collection I find them in. So I'm gonna have to do a little research, and maybe I can share some PDFs of the Romanian versions of those tunes, because I know I have a couple somewhere.
Yeah, that would be great. It's I mean, having, especially for me personally, and Joel here, I know, having grown up in a land of oleanders, but as if any of you have read my material on Ben Basler, his term for what we call, you know, slow horror or joc was Londra, you know, Landra. I mean, there are other examples of that too, not just Ben,
Right.
which also takes it on.
Wait, can you say that again? His version of joc was, he called them Londres?
His turn, yeah. This is, I'm sure it's in my article in the Klezmer Roots and Offshoots, the Sloven Anthology. Yeah, Ben called that rhythm, or that genre, the horror, slow horror, joc, etc. He called it Londres. And not even Landra really, which to me says, because I'm not sure where there's echo coming from somewhere, but It's not me. Anyway, the fact that he said Londra and not Leandra to me tells me that it's a name that he got from the Podolian and Bessarabian musicians who he played with in Tashkent, so starting in 1947. But he did say that they played them that kind of tune, which he still called Londra, and he may have called it Landre even then, talking about his playing with his uncle Nusen Śpiewak in Warsaw and around central Poland before the war. So he said we played those kinds of tunes.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, and now of course, it's just popping in my head, and maybe I'm late to the dance on this, so to speak. But is the oleander or the lendl, is that related to the Ländler?
No, no. To me, it's pretty very
both in three, and
I wouldn't even say it would be very rash to assert that it's connected with the name in the Romanian repertoire, oleandre, which I'm trying to remember where that came from. Other than and Zev's gone here too, but Christina, do any of you know is that a Turkish genre too? Was there something, or what I mean is Greco-Ottoman really, something about oleandre and oleanders and all that stuff?
That wouldn't surprise me. I'll follow up with Zev on that.
I
Sure.
always thought it was Romanian, but the thing is that but this of course is not in that meter.
Yeah, it's not in 3. This one isn't.
So I mean, like that, which just means that terms migrate across genres too.
Right.
But I do, yeah.
How did the mention? Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I just remember hearing the term or reading the term Lundra a long time ago. I didn't know what it meant, but I remember seeing that. Anyway.
But and all of the ones that Ilana has put the numbers into the chat here, those pieces are all in 3 of some variety, and they're all in the Jock section at the very end of JIFM. So that's
right.
What Michael has to say. I see you, John Geometric. We'll get to you. Why don't you give us what you got, John?
Just a quick point, like sort of to reinforce what Jeffrey's discovered in this novel about, the potentially fictitious, potentially based on a lot of real events. Like a lot of the similarities, I think personally, it's a miracle that these recordings exist. I say that dependent on the fact that, or given the fact that I don't know a lot about the Russian recording industry, but if they're anything like a lot of other companies, they weren't going out into the countryside to find talent. So it makes sense, like this type of material shows up in the Romanian repertoire, but not in the commercial repertoire. It shows up in the field recordings. It shows up in the sheet music that Christina's found. But so essentially, it lends credence to the fact that someone would have brought this band to Warsaw for the purposes of recording. And in that sense, it's an absolute miracle. But Jeffrey has something to say to that.
Hi, Rosa. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
The Russian recording industry did in fact record a lot of ethnic music quite early on. How exactly they did that, I'm not sure. I think they probably recorded it more in local areas, but they weren't field recordings.
No.
They did because they, as somebody, I think maybe it was Mike Aylward pointed out, the idea of these record companies, the dealers were, and sometimes often the record companies themselves were selling phonographs, and the records they were putting out were loss leaders very often. They didn't expect to sell necessarily a lot of records, but they did expect to sell phonographs to play the records. And so they were just experimenting with all kinds of ethnic groups. And I do know that in Russia they recorded, even in Central Asia and so on, that type of music. And you can, many of these records are still, exist.
I think Michael Alpert said something. I mean, Michael Alpert somewhere said that the companies were selling record players,
Gotcha,
and
Michael.
the records were secondary.
Yeah,
But
that's
but the model is almost exactly the same as the one that Ansky used. He'd just turn up with his team, set up in a big hotel, and invite people to come and record. And that's also the same way that the American recording industry worked to a large extent.
but I don't think they recorded in hotel rooms in Russia.
Well, that's what Ansky did.
Yes, of course he did. But I'm saying he really was an ethnographer.
But do you not think the record companies might have used the same basic model?
Sometimes they use cinemas, I found as well. Cinema houses.
Yeah, somewhere large and some public where people could turn up, some central social point in the village, in the shtetl.
Although there wasn't necessarily, I think, in most cases, cash. It wasn't a commercial enterprise what Ansky et al. Were doing.
That's true.
Right, but still, so possibly more care was taken to find a really a quieter place and so forth.
I believe I don't have absolute, we don't have, I don't have proof of this, but I think we know that the Amur recordings were made in Warsaw. We do know that, thanks to Mike Aylward's research. I think probably the Serenas were made in Warsaw also, which is quite a ways from Lipovitz, and they, they would have had to travel there. They could have been made in some other city like Kiev. It's possible because they had smaller recording things set up in the preface to Stelliarsky's book that Mike sent to me. He talks about this, how they did set up recording places in various other cities. This is specifically Serena, and Kiev was one of them. And they probably, like in a record shop, they might have done it.
I want to turn to Michael Aylward, who is, since he's with us and he can speak to this himself. Yeah. And Mike, I'm sorry I keep muting you. It's because I think you're the source of the echo. So why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself now and chime into this conversation. There we are.
Yeah, almost first time I've been a source of an echo in my life. Right. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we got you.
Okay. Yes, but actually the truth is, as far as I can see, there is very little difference between a field recording expedition pre-World War, the First World War, and a commercial one. The basic equipment they were using was pretty much the same, and they were commercial recorders were operating on pretty much the same kind of conditions as the non-commercial ones, and they were extremely mobile, and they did record. They recorded in all the main venues: Vienna, kind of Berlin, Warsaw, Kiev, Odessa. But they also recorded in very, at least the Gramophone Company, for which we had the most detailed records. They recorded in all kinds of very obscure places. So you have to take that into account.
I see Sherry, I see Jeff, and then with those two major figures, we're going to wrap up our conversation because we have been epically hanging out here for like 2.5 hours. And so let me give the last words to Jeff and Sherry to help us wrap up this conversation. And then to be continued. We're going to have another roundtable session next week where we're going to get to talk about all this a lot more. So we'll make sure you have the links to that. But go ahead, Jeff and Sherry, and let's wrap this up, okay?
Well, let me just say my one sentence and let Jeff have the last word. I just wanted to remind folks of what Jeff said earlier about the fact that Belf had a contract. That sort of indicates that this wasn't just some guy randomly wandering into a setup saying, hey, come on down. I mean, to have a contract, somebody had to take a deliberate act. So if that's in fact true, that does suggest that there was intention to this somehow.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I think, that is one thing that we don't really have any reason to doubt that. He specifically says in that article in the Gramophone In Focus that he got a contract. Now, taking account of what, let's say, who was it just talking about? I'm sorry, I'm getting a little tired.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot, yeah.
I was just talking about Mike Aylward. Okay, in some ways it was perhaps similar to send a expedition out. And of course, we know in the United States, they used to do that, but it was later. I think a lot of it has to do with the quality of the equipment, because if you listen to the Ansky cylinders, they're really bad quality. Yes, they've been damaged, but I don't think they were ever anywhere near. And even the Syrenas are not that good, but they're a lot better. And so I think even if the gramophone company sent an expedition out to who knows where to record something, they would have had better equipment than a lot of these ethnographers had. That's.
Yeah, I think gramophone.
Yeah.
Gramophone company was in a league of its own. But I'm thinking like smaller labels like Sirena. I mean, they wouldn't have just gone out into the countryside to record people, or would they? That's what I was asking, essentially.
Well,
I mean,
there seems to be some difference of opinion about what that exactly means, but all I can say is there was a lot of ethnic recording in Russia, in the larger, including way out in Central Asia and the Caucasus and so on in those days. In fact, you can see it in the catalogs and in the trade journals, the releases. It's really quite impressive. And but as far as Belf is concerned, I don't think that's how they got recorded.
Right. Well, and if they're doing a big epic, epic sessions, they must have had a sort of it speaks to a dedicated.
And even if they, right, and even if they went to Kiev rather than Warsaw, Kiev is quite a trip also from.
Right.
So,
Okay, well, very reluctantly, I know we could all stay, and there are so many more topics that we could be nerding out about that it's going to leave to me to say, Jeffrey, thank you so much for not only for sharing this amazing research with us. This is like detective work par excellence, and we just appreciate you so much for sharing it with us, and the fact that we have so many of these recordings available to us, and thanks again to Sherry for sharing these amazing recordings. And you know what? For all of you who are still here, hanging in, Sherry told me just this afternoon that it's conceivable that she has 2 more sides that we're going to share for our roundtable next week that nobody else has, that once again we'll be able to premiere them for our roundtable. So
Zagoners. Let your kids do.
So huge thanks to Sherry, huge thanks to Jeffrey, and thanks to all of you for hanging in there and hanging in here and being with us today. We'll see you again next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's been fun.
Bye, everybody. This is great.